So Armand, should we ready to roll?
Yes, we're ready.
Brilliant, thank you. So hello to everyone who's joining us and continuing to join us. And of course, thank you for joining this webinar today. It is actually a real pleasure to have you here with us, and we really hope that you'll be an active participant in our consultation process. I'm Josephine Jackson. I'm the Vice Chair of the IAASB, and I'm also Chair of the Sustainability Task Force, and I will be monitoring this webinar today. I'm here with a great crew of speakers, of course, all of whom are key members of the Sustainability Task Force as well. And in order of speaking, that's Neil Morris, Jamie Shannon, Susan Jones, and Dan Montgomery. Assisting us in the background with the webinar are Armand and Michelle and TK, Claire, IAASB staff. They're also on hand to help us answer some of your questions. So why are we talking about this new standard? Well, the IAASB have prioritised the completion of proposed 5000 as a standalone end-to-end sustainability-specific standard. And that's because the board and our stakeholders believe that users of sustainability information will benefit from external assurance provided by independent assurance professionals committed to a high level of ethical standards. There's also a need for a global baseline developed through robust due process and completely transparent manner. This is just as important, of course, on the assurance side as it is on the reporting side. In addition, we believe that we should have an assurance standard that builds upon well-tested practices already in place in the global market. But from a very practical perspective, we are aware that in some countries, particularly those in the European Union, there are already mandatory assurance requirements for sustainability reporting with some tight timelines. And for those reasons, it is important that we moved quickly, but thoughtfully. So to publish our proposal, therefore, it is at this point we really need your input to make it better and ultimately to finalise a standard that will deliver a sustainability assurance engagement in terms of quality and confidence to where we are on a financial statement audit. So today we're going to take a deep dive into the very important topic of assurance on sustainability reporting. And in our time together, we'll be talking through how proposed 5000 addresses the key elements of a sustainability assurance engagement. If you could move the slide, Michelle, I can set up the stage, as it were. So before we deep dive into the standard, Neil will give us an overall introduction to the standard. Then we'll be rolling up our sleeves a bit as Jamie talks us through some of the key concepts, principles, and definitions. Susan will continue our deep dive and talk about practitioner materiality and the approach to risk and response. Then Dan will cover some of the final important areas, misstatements, other information, communication, reporting. Before we close, I'll give you a flavour of the other outreach activity we also have planned. Now, if you have any feedback or questions, please post those in the Q&A box. We'll be keeping a lookout for them during the discussion, and I have various points I'll be pausing to raise some of those with our panel of speakers. We may not be able to address all the questions in the Q&A box today, but take heart, we will take them all away and have them in mind when we finalise the standard, or perhaps in developing non-authoritative guidance like FAQs. So please keep them coming. So on to the next slide, please. So let's get started and kick off with Neil, who's going to provide our overall introduction. So Neil, I'm handing over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Josephine, and good day to all of you. It's terrific to be here to take you through the introduction. If we can click over to the next slide, please, Michelle. A few key things that I wanted to highlight on this slide. I mean, first of all, this is looking to set a global baseline for sustainability assurance. And as Josephine indicated, a key piece of this is that this is the timely standard setting action that we're needing to have in place. And so the timeline is really important, but we're coming off a terrific base with the assurance standards that we already have. So the proposed ISSA 5000 is an overarching standard for sustainability assurance engagements. And it's going to cover the entire engagement from engagement acceptance, evaluating those preconditions, acceptance, and then all the way through to reporting. There's much greater specificity than our foundational assurance standards being ISA 3000 and 3410, which are the primary standards used for sustainability and climate reporting assurance today. Now, having a global baseline will allow for a future set of standards to address specific types of sustainability assurance engagements on specific topics, perhaps something like human rights or biodiversity or aspects of topics. Maybe there's processes or systems and controls, strategy or performance against targets. We'll launch such projects in response to whatever the practitioners' needs are and their requests, as well as the evolving regulatory requirements or market practices that we see developing in this area. If we can head over to the next slide. So the standard really is suitable for all sustainability topics, as well as the information disclosed about those topics. And so you can see across the top all the different types of elements that we're looking to address. I mean, as an overarching standard, it's also important that it's standalone. So unlike the IAASB's other assurance standards, there's no need now to go back and forth between ISA 3000 to understand the foundational principles for performance of an assurance engagement. And personally, I really like that this would then be standalone. We've written the standard to be framework and topic neutral, so that it can be applied across whichever framework a company adopts. And these frameworks are evolving as we stand today. And so it could be the ESRSs, it could be the ISSB standards, just as an example. I mean, the overarching standard also accommodates additional reporting requirements in specific jurisdictions. So some jurisdictions, for example, may have electronic tagging, or there could be some specific compliance requirements. And I think the standard accommodates this. So it can be reported in conjunction with assurance on the sustainability information. Importantly, the standard is relevant to professional accountants as well as non-accountants. So something that we've been terming being profession agnostic, which is of course the same for our other assurance standards that we have in place today. It's as important as well that it can be used for both limited and reasonable assurance engagements. We'll cover this in more detail. And I particularly like the idea of how engagements may evolve from limited to reasonable assurance and how the standard would be flexible to accommodate those changes in time. So the IAASB standards, including 3000 and 3410, already members of the engagement team are subject to the provisions of the ethics code and the quality management standards, or other professional requirements or requirements in law or regulations that are at least as demanding, and that's applicable for the ISSA 5000 standard too. I mean, finally, the IAASB developed the 5000 to be principle-based. I mean, while still providing sufficient specificity to drive consistency in the conduct of the sustainability assurance engagement, regardless of the size and complexity, and to address the challenges in conducting the engagement. So finding that balance about being specific, driving consistency, but also giving the principles to be adaptable for the various circumstances will be something important to know if we've achieved. So thanks very much, Josephine. I think it's back to you.
Oh, thank you, Neil, for that introduction. It certainly does help set the stage for the deeper dive. Michelle, could you flip to the next slide now, please? Thank you. Jamie, I'm going to turn it over to you now to discuss an area that the board obviously spent a lot of time talking about, particularly the key principles, concepts and definitions, which of course are critically important to get pinned down before you embark on these engagements. So Jamie, thank you. Over to you.
Thanks, Josephine, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, absolutely. Definitions are central to 5000, and we will certainly explain some of the new definitions that are appearing in the standard. So, like ISA 3000, ED 5000 addresses the key elements of an assurance engagement. So that covers the parties involved, the criteria to be used, also often referred to as the reporting framework, the information to be reported, obtaining evidence to support the assurance conclusion, and ultimately providing a written conclusion. In this segment of the webinar, we're going to address a few of the key principles and concepts that underpin a sustainability assurance engagement. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Michelle. While ISSA 5000 is based largely on ISA 3000, there are several key principles, concepts, and as I mentioned, in particular definitions that are specific to ISSA 5000. So let's start off with some of the key terminology. Specifically, what I want to cover is three important definitions that are absolutely fundamental to how the requirements in the standard have been drafted. So those are sustainability matters, sustainability information, and disclosures. And I will draw your attention to Appendix 1 of ED 5000 that explains the relationship of these terms, which hopefully people will find useful. In coming up with these definitions, the IAASB acknowledged that it was important to have clear and consistent understanding of how these terms are used in the standard, but also recognise that these terms are difficult to define because they're actually used and described differently in sustainability reporting standards, in frameworks, and in other sources. The IAASB has sought to keep the definitions framework neutral, while still remaining consistent with other IAASB standards, in particular ISA 3000 revised. So let me start off with sustainability information, so the green boxes on the slide. So this is the information that an entity presents through some kind of reporting mechanism. For example, a separate sustainability report, an integrated report, possibly part of an overall annual report, or indeed in some other form. The IAASB wanted a definition of sustainability information that was as simple and straightforward as possible. Therefore, in its simplest terms, sustainability information is information about sustainability matters. And that's really the core of the definition. For those with a technically minded focus, sustainability information is what is known in other IAASB assurance standards as the subject matter information. So I mentioned sustainability matters, moving over to the blue boxes. So what exactly do we mean by that? Well, this can cover a wide range of environmental, social, economic, and cultural topics. And the information that's provided by the entity can address different aspects of those topics. The slide shows a few examples of topics and aspects of topics, and a more detailed list of examples is included in paragraph A32 of the exposure draft. Now, the definition of sustainability matters was intended to be as broad as possible to reflect the current sustainability reporting environment. And so it includes references to topics, aspects of topics, and also the notion of impacts of the entity on the environment and vice versa. And I will come on to the notion of double materiality shortly. The last key term I want to cover in this slide is disclosures. ED 5000 defines disclosures as specific information related to an aspect of a topic, and that will also relate to a topic generally. Disclosures can be in various forms. For example, it might be narrative information, it could be a table with metrics, or other quantitative information. And a disclosure could just be nothing more than a single sentence or paragraph. Again, it could be a table, or it could in fact span multiple pages in a report. As you will see a bit later on, disclosures is a fundamentally important concept in ED 5000 in terms of what that means for planning, risk assessment, and responding to risks. If we can move to the next slide, please, Michelle. So the second key element of an assurance engagement and a key concept in ED 5000 that we want to explore is the criteria. As many of you will know, criteria are the benchmarks used to measure or evaluate the sustainability matters. The most common reference you'll see in the exposure draft is to the applicable criteria, being the criteria used for a particular sustainability assurance engagement. An important part of accepting or continuing an assurance engagement is making sure that the criteria that will be used are both suitable in the circumstances and also will be available to the intended users. Now, as noted earlier, ED 5000 has been developed to be framework neutral, so it can be used for assurance and sustainability information prepared using any suitable criteria. Now, that could be framework criteria, criteria developed by the entity, or in many cases, a combination of both. Now, this is important as the sustainability reporting landscape is rapidly evolving, with frameworks and other criteria being developed in many jurisdictions and mandatory reporting also being included in many introduced into many jurisdictions. So although the standard is framework neutral, the board did look at different sustainability reporting standards and key jurisdictional reporting requirements as a basis for understanding whether the proposals in ED 5000 are appropriate and can be practically applied. So, for example, that included looking at the ISSB standards and also in Europe looking at the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the related assurance requirements in the ESRS standards. So, as I said, the applicable criteria drives the selection of the matters to be disclosed. And I think a key point is to highlight that management of the entity has the primary responsibility for determining the topics and the aspects of the topics and how they will be presented in accordance with those criteria. Now, this process is referred to in lots of different ways, but commonly it might be described as the entity's materiality process or materiality assessment. I said I would come back to the concept of double materiality. Double materiality recognises that the information needs of the intended users may relate to the impact of sustainability matters on the entity, referred to as financial materiality, or it could refer to the impacts of the entity itself on those sustainability matters, so-called impact materiality, or it could be both. The reporting framework may require the application of the concept of double materiality. Again, for example, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. So when required, the entity's materiality process needs to cover both aspects when determining the sustainability information to be reported. Importantly, the needs of the intended users will not always include both those perspectives. Therefore, the concept of double materiality is not always relevant to every engagement. I think another point to highlight is that management's materiality process, including the application of double materiality when required, is different from how the practitioner views materiality. Although the requirements of the reporting framework provide a frame of reference, the practitioner considers or determines materiality in developing the approach for obtaining evidence and when evaluating identified misstatements of the sustainability information. When required, the practitioner will also look at that double materiality lens in making their materiality judgments, including when evaluating the effect of uncorrected misstatements. And we'll cover misstatements a little bit later in this webinar. The last point to cover in this slide, just looking at the orange box, is the reference to assertions. And that's really just there to highlight another key concept in ED 5000 and to act as a reminder that assertions are linked to the disclosures. So let's move to the next slide, please, Michelle. So the last piece I want to cover here in terms of the overall sort of engagement level considerations is the scope of the assurance engagement. And this is really, again, a critical part of engagement acceptance procedures addressed in the standard. What you'll see in paragraph 4 of ED 5000 is that the scope of engagement may extend to all of the sustainability information that's expected to be reported by the entity, or in many cases, it will only include part of that information. So as part of engagement acceptance and continuance procedures, the practitioner needs to obtain a preliminary knowledge of the information that's expected to be reported. And that's important, and it's to know the entirety of what management plans to report, because the practitioner may determine that the engagement doesn't actually have a rational purpose if the scope is limited to only certain information, and in the practitioner's judgment, that limited narrow scope is misleading to intended users. So really a core part of understanding what's reported and what is being asked for assurance. The IAASB did think about whether separate terms might be useful to clarify the differences between the sustainability information that is reported by the entity and the sustainability information that is subject to the assurance engagement. However, after careful consideration, the IAASB concluded that having separate terms would just add complexity. It was also noted, for example, that other standards, such as ISA 3410, also contemplates that not all the information being reported is going to be subject to assurance. Therefore, when the assurance engagement does not cover the entirety of the information that the entity reports, the term sustainability information in the standard is to be read as only that information that is in fact subject to the assurance engagement. So, therefore, a question arises about what about everything else that's reported that's not within that scope? And let me just refer to that as the other stuff. And that's going to include any sustainability related information that's not subject to engagement, plus anything else that's reported that's not related to sustainability information. And that all falls into the bucket of other information, the same concept that we see in other ISSB standards, and we'll cover other information a bit later on in the webinar. So the scope of the engagement, including whether the practitioner will issue an assurance conclusion on the whole of the information or just in part, affects a number of different aspects of the engagement, including both the materiality judgments, the risk procedures, the further procedures to respond to those risks, evaluating misstatements, and ultimately reporting. You'll see a reference to greenhouse gas statements with a question mark. So as explained in paragraph 19 of the explanatory memorandum, the IAASB noted the need for a very clear and straightforward approach regarding the relationship of ED 5000 and ISA 3410. The IAASB recognised that in many cases, a greenhouse gas statement may be included alongside other sustainability information, and the practitioner may or may not be asked to provide a separate conclusion on that greenhouse gas statement. Ultimately, the IAASB concluded that ED 5000 should apply to all assurance engagements on sustainability information, except when the practitioner is providing a separate conclusion on a greenhouse gas statement, in which case ISA 3410 applies. And that's explained in paragraph 2 of the ED. The IAASB has also proposed a conforming amendment to the scope section of ISA 3410 to mirror this approach. So that's a kind of run through of the key concepts and definitions as it relates to thinking about the engagement. And once the scope of the engagement is known, the practitioner can then start to think about the approach, including the resources that they might need to perform the engagement. So let's move to the next slide, please, Michelle. So this slide sets out the individuals that might be involved in the engagement. And this is really quite a key area of the standard, as it has direct implications for both quality management and the ability to obtain evidence. Sustainability assurance engagements may be performed in a wide range of sustainability matters, and that may require specialised skills and knowledge beyond those that are possessed by the engagement leader or other members of the engagement team. And that in turn may necessitate the need to use the work of a practitioner's expert. A practitioner's expert may be either internal to the firm, and by definition are therefore a member of the engagement team, or they may be a practitioner's external expert, who by definition is not part of the engagement team. In addition, the sustainability information subject to the assurance engagement may include information from numerous entities, both within the entity's organisational boundary, but also may include information from entities up and down the entity's value chain. In those circumstances, the engagement team may seek to use the work performed or that is planned to be performed by some other assurance practitioner on that value chain. And I think it's key to note that that may be either from within the practitioner's firm's network, or it could be from an entirely different firm. Accordingly, the board felt it was very important that ED 5000 needed to accommodate all these different scenarios as depicted on this slide. The diagram hopefully should look familiar as it's reproduced from paragraph 87 of the explanatory memorandum, and it's a visual illustration of the various individuals that might be involved in a sustainability assurance engagement. And it also explains the requirements in ED 5000 that apply to the work of those individuals. Paragraphs 82 to 93 of the explanatory memorandum describe all of this in detail, so we're only going to cover a few key points in this webinar. Ultimately, the requirements in ED 5000 are based on a couple of key quality management principles. Firstly, the engagement leader has overall responsibility for managing and achieving quality on the engagement, and for being sufficiently and appropriately involved throughout the engagement. So they've got a basis for determining that the significant judgments made and the conclusions reached are appropriate. The engagement leader also takes responsibility for the direction and supervision of the members of the engagement team and the review of their work. Therefore, if the practitioner intends to use the work of a practitioner's external expert or a firm other than the practitioner's own firm, it's important for the engagement leader to determine whether they will be able to be sufficiently and appropriately involved in that work, as is the case for work being performed by members of the engagement team from the practitioner's own firm. So as you can see from the diagram, the requirements in ED 5000 are primarily based on an expectation that the practitioner is able to be sufficiently appropriately involved in the work. And therefore, with the exclusion of external experts, who as mentioned are not part of the engagement team, any individuals that perform procedures on the engagement and for whom the practitioner is able to direct, supervise and review their work, they all form part of the engagement team. And the requirements in the standard that apply to directing and supervising the engagement team and reviewing their work will apply. And as I said, this may include individuals from other firms within or outside the practitioner's firm network. So that then leaves us with the other situation. So when another firm performs assurance work and the practitioner is unable to direct, supervise and review that work, such firms and the individuals that perform those procedures are not members of the engagement team, and they're referred to in ED 5000 as another practitioner. And in these circumstances, it may still be possible to use the work of another practitioner, and therefore paragraphs 51 to 54 of the standard walk the practitioner through the various steps required to first make that determination and to also decide whether that work is adequate for the purposes of the sustainability assurance engagement. That was a very quick run through of some of the really key concepts, and I'll now hand you back to Josephine for some Q&A.
Lovely, thanks, Jamie. So Michelle, we can pop on to the next slide. Thank you. I personally really like the way you actually set up those first 3 slides, Jamie, to pull together the pieces of this quite complex jigsaw of key concepts and terms in a very nice, simplified manner. And I would encourage our participants to, look to those slides when deep diving into the standard, along with the chart on individuals involved in the engagement, which of course is a great summary. And that might be why, Jamie, we've actually surprisingly got absolutely no questions on the definitions at all. So, so that's great. Thank you. One thing you did mention is the potential future of 3410 in there. And another question that has cropped up before is the EER guidance. We did look to the EER guidance, of course, in developing the exposure draft, but perhaps you could comment on the future of that guidance. I mean, are we going to mothball it, update it?
No, absolutely. And yeah, certainly I don't think anyone wants to mothball the guidance, because various stakeholders have expressed views that it's actually really very helpful in practice. What I would say is the EER guidance is much more detailed and includes far more examples than can reasonably be included in a principles-based standard. So it can still be referred to as useful guidance, both when using 5000 as today for ISA 3000. As with all the activity of the IAASB, the need to update the EER guidance will be considered as part of the IAASB's due process, taking into account the feedback on 5000 and looking at the future work plan. So that will be something that the board will consider as part of its overall future strategy and work plan.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you, Jamie. Neil, you talked about this being a standalone standard, but we did look to other standards in developing 5000. What were our primary go-tos when we were developing this standard?
Yeah, I mean, Josephine, the first is we've got a terrific base coming off 3000, right? And 3000 sets that baseline for us to begin from. 3410 gave us some specific content, although it's GHG specific. It allowed us to sort of imagine how that could be more applicable to the sustainability environment. I mean, staying within the IAASB, Jamie mentioned the EER, and I think all of the drafters really liked that EER guidance, and so went to that EER guidance to draw from that in the development of ISSA 5000. So, that really did allow us to accelerate the development and the timelines for building 5000, because we had this good base of 3000, 3410, the EER, and then going into some of the auditing standards, which we know have been recently updated, and drawing from some of the principles there that we think would be relevant in an insurance environment related to sustainability information. Right.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much, Jamie and Neil. And Michelle, if we can pop to the next slide now, we will move ahead. We're just a little ahead of time, but not much. Over to Susan Jones, who's going to cover the topics of practitioner materiality, risk and response. Again, really critical to the elements of assurance engagement. And yesterday, my colleague Diane described it as the exciting elements of an assurance engagement. So back to you, Susan, to talk about the exciting elements of assurance engagement. Thank you.
Well, I'm very excited. Thank you, Josephine. I am Susan Jones, and I'm here to present to you the highlights of the materiality and risk and response section of the exposure draft. So next slide, please, Michelle. Thank you. So first, let's talk about materiality. So materiality, of course, is a matter of judgment, and it is based on the practitioner's perception of the information needs of intended users. A misstatement is material if it would influence the decisions of users. And we heard from outreach that the concept of materiality in sustainability reporting is challenging, but important to stakeholders, the entity, and the practitioner. The challenges arise from the fact that unlike financial statements, which are reported in a single currency unit, sustainability information may be measured in different units. For example, a sustainability report could include, among other things, carbon dioxide emissions measured in tons and safety violations measured in terms of instances. Furthermore, sustainability information often includes qualitative disclosures, for example, descriptions of processes. The different measurement units make it difficult to determine materiality for the sustainability information as a whole. It is more challenging to determine materiality when planning and performing an engagement for qualitative disclosures, and it is because it's difficult to assign a number to qualitative disclosures. However, we did hear on outreach that practitioners do apply the concept of materiality to the evaluation of misstatements identified in qualitative disclosures. So, for example, they may stand back and look at the misstatements overall in their qualitative disclosures, and while each one may not be considered material, they may aggregate up to a material misstatement overall. So therefore, the proposed ISSA would require the practitioner in planning and performing the engagement for quantitative disclosures to determine materiality and also to determine performance materiality to deal with aggregation risk in the quantitative disclosures, which is consistent with ISAE 3410. The practitioner would also be required to consider materiality for the qualitative disclosures, and that would occur, as I said before, more on when you're evaluating those misstatements. Now, as Jamie mentioned earlier, some criteria may use the term material or materiality in determining the process that the entity uses to identify the information that is relevant to users and to be included in the report. And as Jamie mentioned, although understanding management's materiality process may be useful to the practitioner, that process as contemplated by the criteria is different than the practitioner's consideration of materiality. So the practitioner's materiality is focused on misstatements that, if material, would be reasonably affected to influence the decisions of users. Management's materiality process is focused on the information that is relevant to the intended users and should be included in the report. Next question, or next slide, please, Michelle. So I also want to focus on the risk assessment or the risk and response sections of the standard. And so let's start focusing on risk. To identify risks, the practitioner must first obtain an understanding of the entity and its environment, the applicable criteria, and the system of internal control. So the question is there a difference in understanding required between reasonable and limited assurance engagements? And yes, the proposed standard differentiates between the extent of understanding that is required and what the practitioner is required to understand. The extent of understanding required is indicated by the purpose of that understanding. In a limited assurance engagement, the purpose of the understanding is to identify disclosures in the sustainability information where material misstatements are likely to arise and design procedures to focus on those disclosures. So in a limited assurance engagement, the practitioner focuses procedures on the riskier disclosures at the level of the disclosure. In a reasonable assurance engagement, the purpose of the understanding is to identify and assess the risks of material misstatement at the assertion level for the disclosures and design for the procedures. As Jamie mentioned earlier, assertions are basically facets of the disclosures, and they include, among other things, the completeness or occurrence of the disclosure, its accuracy, quantification, classification. There's a more complete list in the proposed standard, but it is a more granular focus on the disclosures at the assertion level. So in a reasonable assurance engagement, we're focused on the risk of material misstatement at the assertion level. Next slide, please. Michelle, thank you. All right, so next we come to the practitioner's understanding of the components of internal control. And here again, there's a differentiation between limited and reasonable assurance engagements related to the required understanding of the entity system of internal control. So if we start first about talking about the extent of the understanding of the components of internal control, in a reasonable assurance engagement, the practitioner is required to understand and evaluate that component. In a limited assurance engagement, the practitioner is required to understand the component, but not necessarily required to evaluate the component. So when we speak about what the practitioner is required to understand, in all cases, for both limited and reasonable assurance engagements, the board believes it is important to understand the entity's control environment and the entity's system of the entity's information system relevant to sustainability information. With respect to the entity's risk assessment and monitoring procedures, the board believes that understanding those procedures or processes may go beyond what is appropriate for a limited assurance engagement. So, understanding those processes is not required for a limited assurance engagement. However, understanding the results of the entity's risk assessment process would be helpful to the practitioner in identifying disclosures where material misstatements are likely to arise in a limited assurance engagement. Therefore, in a limited assurance engagement, the practitioner is required to understand the results of the entity's risk assessment process. With respect to control activities, in a reasonable assurance engagement, the practitioner is required to understand the control activities component. Understanding the control activities component includes understanding those controls that the practitioner intends to test operating effectiveness of to obtain evidence, and any general IT controls related to those controls that the practitioner intends to test, and any other controls that the practitioner judges necessary to identify risks or design further procedures. Now, understanding a control means evaluating the design of the control and determining whether it has been implemented. In both limited assurance and reasonable assurance engagements, if the practitioner plans to test the operating effectiveness of a control to obtain evidence, then the practitioner is required to understand that control and any related general IT controls. So it doesn't really make any sense to test our operating effectiveness of a control without understanding whether it has been designed effectively and implemented. Next slide, please, Michelle. So after obtaining their understanding and identifying the risk of material misstatement at the assertion level for a reasonable assurance engagement, or disclosures where material misstatements are likely to or more likely to arise in a limited assurance engagement, the practitioner then designs and performs procedures that are focused on those disclosures in the sustainability information where material misstatements are likely to arise in a limited assurance engagement, and procedures that are responsive to the risk of material misstatement at the assertion level for the disclosures in a reasonable assurance engagement. So in their toolkit, the practitioner has tests of controls, which the practitioner would only do if they had obtained an understanding of those controls and if the practitioner plans to obtain evidence about them. Otherwise, you wouldn't bother testing controls. And the practitioner also has substantive procedures. The overall, however, sometimes in the practitioner may identify conditions that indicate the misstatements may occur pervasively throughout the sustainability information. So we have overall risks throughout the sustainability information. These conditions may include things like a deficient control environment, or identified or suspected fraud or noncompliance with laws and regulations, or a situation where the practitioner has identified material misstatements throughout the sustainability information. Material misstatements are just popping out all over. In these cases, the practitioner performs overall responses, which may include things like closer direction, supervision, and review of staff, or calling in more experienced staff, more procedures conducted at the period end rather than at the interim date, an added element of unpredictability in testing, or increasing the extent of procedures. Next slide, please, Michelle. Thank you. So now, if we're in a limited assurance engagement, the objective of that limited assurance engagement is to be able to report whether a matter has come to the practitioner's attention to cause the practitioner to believe that the sustainability information is not prepared or fairly presented in all material respects in accordance with the applicable criteria. So in focusing the procedures that we've been performing on disclosures in the sustainability information where material misstatements are likely to arise, the practitioner may identify matters that cause them to believe that there may be a misstatement. When this happens, the practitioner performs what we have been calling the deep dive, and thus we have the image of the diver on this slide, in case you were wondering about that. The practitioner performs additional procedures on those disclosures until they have either concluded that the information is not likely to be misstated or determined that there is, in fact, a material misstatement. So if the practitioner is unable to include either or conclude either way, then a scope limitation exists and the practitioner cannot form an unmodified opinion or conclusion. Next slide, please, Michelle. So the proposed standard also includes in our response section to responding to risks, requirements and guidance related to analytical procedures. The standard contemplates the use of analytical procedures, but again, there's a differentiation between limited and reasonable assurance. When performing analytical procedures, the practitioner is required to develop an expectation about recorded quantities or ratios. However, the expectation is expected to be more precise in a reasonable assurance engagement than in a limited assurance engagement. We also heard on outreach that forward-looking information and estimates are common in sustainability information and that guidance is needed. Forward-looking information may include forecast projections and information about future risks and opportunities, for example, disclosures associated with transition to net zero. Both forward-looking information and estimates have a degree of uncertainty and judgment. Regardless of the source of the degree of uncertainty or the extent of judgment involved, it is necessary for management to appropriately apply the applicable criteria and select and use appropriate methods, assumptions, and data when developing estimates and forward-looking information and the related disclosures. Therefore, the IAASB concluded that the most appropriate approach was to address estimates and forward-looking information together in the responding to risk of material misstatements section of the exposure draft. It is possible that this topic will break out into a separate standard under ISSA 5000 going forward, as was mentioned previously. However, there is also a proposed in this standard, there's a proposed differentiation between the work effort required in a limited versus reasonable assurance engagement. In a limited assurance engagement, the practitioner evaluates management's application of the criteria, the methods for developing the estimates or forward-looking information, and the appropriateness of any changes from the prior period in the estimates. The practitioner then considers whether other procedures are necessary. In a reasonable assurance engagement, the practitioner may test how management developed the estimate or forward-looking information, including evaluated the methods, assumptions, and data. The practitioner may develop a point estimate or range to evaluate management's disclosures, or the practitioner may obtain evidence from events occurring up to the date of the practitioner's report. Next slide, please, Michelle. So finally, my last slide, the standard covers or tries to cover off throughout the standard the concepts of professional skepticism and fraud. The proposed standard includes requirements related to the maintenance of professional skepticism throughout the engagement, including a discussion amongst the engagement team as to the susceptibility of disclosures to material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error. designing and performing procedures in an unbiased manner to meet the purpose of the procedures. The standard also includes guidance about resolving any doubts about the relevance and reliability of information to be used as evidence. And if those doubts cannot be resolved, considering the effect on the other aspects of the engagement. And then finally, this standard requires responding appropriately to any fraud or suspected fraud, including responding to management bias, which, if intentional, is fraudulent, and considering whether identified misstatements may be due to fraud. So this ends my prepared remarks about the risk and response section of the exposure draft, and I will hand it back to you, Josephine.
That's great, Susan. Thank you so much. That's been really helpful in highlighting some of the challenges the board had in addressing these concepts, particularly materiality. And as you point out, this is not a financial statement audit. And of course, one giant overall materiality isn't really going to work in the sustainability assurance world quite so easily. So I was thinking similarly, of course, that, you know, scope 1 emissions are numbers as well, but you can't really aggregate those with diversity distribution over the same site, for example. They're all numbers, but they're not like for like. But relating to that point, Susan, a couple of questions that came in, you know, not material for sustainability information as a whole, but for each disclosure. And as you talked about that on your first slide, taking into account that certain frameworks will call for a substantial number of disclosures, as we know already. The question came in, does that mean that 5,000 requires materiality to be calculated for every single quantitative KPI? And you did talk about aggregation at some topic level, though. So could you sort of help us out on what the IAASB were thinking in that regard, Susan? Thank you.
Well, so I think the point is that you need to keep the perception of the information needs of users in mind when determining materiality. So I could imagine a situation where you might aggregate some of those disclosures that are calculated using a common unit, mm-hmm. and determine a materiality for those like disclosures. And if you have disclosures the words aren't coming out. If you have disclosures that aren't necessarily important to the intended needs of users, you know, maybe your materiality might be higher. So I think the key is to focus on the information needs of users. And I do think you could aggregate some of those.
Yeah, we were thinking, I think one of the examples we used in the standard was around occupational health and safety, and things around occupational illnesses and safety in the workplace. And you could look at that as a whole, even though you'll have individual different disclosures there. So yeah, that's really, really helpful. Thank you. Another thing that cropped up and in our webinar yesterday was slightly in relation to Neil's earlier comment about making sure that the proposed standard actually took into account the recent thinking of the board. It wasn't just a matter of taking what we already had and bunching it together. We really had to think about what else we'd achieved recently in our work. ISSA 315, one of our favorites, you and I, when it was revised, we explicitly distinguished between the concepts of inherent risk and control risk. And I wondered if you could maybe just talk a little about why we didn't do the same or take that approach when we were developing 5,000.
Of course, we did. The board did think about that. And what we heard on outreach was that this space is still developing, and a lot of entities don't have well-developed controls. And the concepts of inherent and control risk, it may be just premature to require a separate inherent and control risk assessment in this space. So at this time, we did not do that. However, there is nothing in the standard that would prohibit a practitioner from doing that. If a practitioner felt like the best approach would be to evaluate or assess inherent risk and assess control risk and combine them, then that would not be in a violation of the standard. But we just heard that our clients aren't necessarily ready for that.
Yeah, and I agree. If the practitioner believes that would be more a helpful approach, then of course they can certainly use that. It'll be interesting though to see if this comes up in the comment letters, or whether whether there's a drive for us to actually go the full direction of 315 and that greater specificity, or whether people are comfortable with that, really keeping it at that principal space as you've suggested.
Well, or there might be something in between. So for
Yes.
example, we could describe more fully a separate risk assessment, but not necessarily require it.
Yeah. Jamie, I'm actually going to call on Jamie now. Jamie, we had a question sort of goes back to you a little bit regarding the work effort in terms of suitable criteria, because of course that's very much part of the key concepts and principles and definitions. The question came through was if the entity is using a recognized framework such as ESRS or ISSB standards, then, what kind of work effort are we expecting in that regard as to compare to something which is probably more entity driven?
Sure. So I guess starting off with the overarching question of, are the criteria suitable? The exposure draft does acknowledge that framework criteria that are set out in law or regulation, or that have been developed by a recognised standard setting body, are presumed to be suitable. But as I mentioned in the slides, excuse me, that doesn't necessarily mean those criteria will always automatically be complete. So for example, as the example I used for the European ESRS standards, the entity will need to supplement those with their own criteria to determine what they need to report. So it's, in most cases, it's likely to be a combination. So while the framework criteria may be presumed suitable, you would still need to evaluate whether the entity developed criteria are also suitable. On top of that, you've still got all the other preconditions. So the practitioner would still need to think about, does the entity have a suitable basis for preparing their information? And as we talked about with respect to the scope of the engagement, is the scope of the assurance engagement suitable, and does that have a rational purpose? So a little bit easier with framework criteria, but you still have to think through all the permutations of the preconditions.
Yeah, no, that's true. It just shows you, it's really worth spending the time and energy in that planning, acceptance and continuance stage, so you don't come across a little later down the line. One of the things that came up, which might be to Neil, actually, if you're still with us, Neil, in terms of group reporting. So Neil is our resident practitioner who actually has to do this on a daily basis. Neil, for group reporting, most parents preparing consolidated accounts aren't going to necessarily prepare single entity disclosures, but only disclosures from the group perspective. I suppose a couple of questions for you is that, in your experience, is that in fact the case? And then in a second question, sorry, I can't find my words today either. Second question is, how do you feel that ISSA 5000 has actually dealt with that consolidated aspect?
Yeah, thanks, Josephine. I mean, absolutely. We're seeing that entities often only present information on a consolidated basis at the listed entity level. We do now see regulations coming in that would require the information to be presented both at the listed entity level, perhaps, but also in country at a significant or material entity level. So we're going to be seeing both at the group level and at the individual company level. The first thing I'd say around group reporting is that it's different to financial reporting. There aren't intercompany transactions. There are no journal entries to try and offset, and it really is an accumulation of information rather than a consolidation. And so consolidation versus the accumulating of the information, I think, is a significant difference in what we're needing to consider in the sustainability environment. Having said that, I think teams do need more assistance around the audits in a group environment. But what we do have around reliance and other practitioners within the reporting entity, I think will get teams a long way down the line in what they need to be able to rely on other practitioners when they're performing this sustainability assurance work for a group as a whole. So the answer, I think, will evolve a little. I think the standard 5000 gets you a long way with how open-minded the standard's been around reliance on others, but we'll see how this evolves and whether there's further guidance needed, and if practitioners are in fact putting that forward as a priority.
Yeah, in fact, that's actually right to the your point right at the very beginning that you know, we have taken account the fact we'll need capacity at some point down the line where there is greater demand for certain aspects, whether that's subject matter, you know, like you know, we need specifics on biodiversity, or if it's even in terms of the engagement. So yeah, it'll be good to really hear from people on that. That's really helpful. Thank you, Neil. Right, so Michelle, if you could move us on to the next slide, we are going to move ahead and bring some of that materiality discussion to life a little bit in respect of misstatements. And Dan is here to also talk to us about other information, communication, reporting. And so on these topics, Dan, I'm handing over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Josephine, and welcome to everyone. And Josephine, here I thought that these were the most exciting topics, but Susan already got that distinction. So we'll cover what certainly are important and some challenging topics addressed in ISSA 5000. So the exposure draft addresses the practitioner's responsibilities for evaluating misstatements of the sustainability information and misstatements identified in the other information. So let's start first with the, if we could go to the next slide, please, Michelle. Thank you. Let's start first with the evaluation of misstatements of the sustainability information subject to the assurance engagement. This has been touched on a little bit in previous segments of this webinar, but we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive here. The definition in the exposure draft notes that a misstatement can be quantitative or qualitative and can arise from either error or fraud. Importantly, also notes that misstatements include omitted information or information that obscures the presentation of the disclosure. The examples are provided in the standard of where or how misstatements in sustainability information may arise, and there are also examples of misstatements due to fraud. Now, just like an audit or any other assurance engagement, this is really a two-step process that might be a little bit of an oversimplification simplification because there's a lot involved. But there are two key elements: accumulating misstatements identified during the engagement, and then evaluating whether misstatements that are not corrected are material, either individually or in the aggregate, as part of forming the assurance conclusion. Now, the latter bit especially, the evaluation of misstatements, sounds simple, but the nature of the sustainability information and the scope of the engagement can make it quite challenging. As Jamie noted earlier on, there could be one overall conclusion on the sustainability information in its entirety, or there could be separate conclusions on a number of different disclosures. There are different a wide variety of sustainability matters and a mix of quantitative and qualitative or narrative information about each of those matters, and then other characteristics as well, judgmental and factual information, historical and forward-looking information, as Susan mentioned. So in developing the requirements and application material in ED 5000 related to the evaluation of misstatements, the IAASB looked to ISA E3000 and 3410 and the EER guidance, which also had some very helpful points. That was the starting point. The board also looked to the auditing standards, ISA 450 in particular, for any additional guidance on evaluating quantitative and qualitative misstatements. Now, it might be obvious, but the evaluation of misstatements is always easier if there aren't any, or if there are only a few. So the exposure draft requires the practitioner to communicate identified misstatements to management on a timely basis and request that they be corrected. That's the first step. And then another important point here is that determining whether uncorrected misstatements are material involves professional judgment. And that's in the context of the framework or the applicable criteria and the engagement circumstances, including who the intended users are and what disclosures are likely to be important. Now, Susan alluded to that a little bit earlier, and clearly there's a link here, a direct link to the judgments about materiality, the needs of intended users, and what might affect their decisions. There could be multiple materialities, as we've mentioned, and Jamie also mentioned earlier applying the double materiality lens when thinking about evaluating misstatements. So just a note here that management's materiality process also might give the practitioner an idea of information that is important to users that would be helpful, both in setting materiality or considering materiality, as well as evaluating misstatements. Now, one of the key challenges in evaluating misstatements for these sustainability assurance engagements relates to qualitative information and information of a dissimilar nature where misstatements can't be readily accumulated. It requires professional judgment, as I mentioned, and the IAASB has included some helpful application material in the exposure draft to help with this process. There's general guidance on how the practitioner may go about accumulating misstatements and evaluating materiality. There's more specific guidance on qualitative factors and other considerations. There's also some guidance related to evaluating misstatements in estimates and forward-looking information. So I would point you to the application material in the proposed standard, particularly paragraphs A412 up to A423. Please have a look at that. And this is such an important area that as your organizations are looking at the ED 5000 and submitting comments on the proposal, please offer any suggestions for additional guidance that might be needed, or your thoughts on the guidance that has been provided. Now, one more aspect of this process is let's look a bit at the level at which misstatements should be evaluated. As noted on the slide here, the process of evaluating misstatements starts at the disclosure level. So, for example, if it's a disclosure about work-related injuries, the practitioner considers whether one or more misstatements were identified in that disclosure. And so if a separate conclusion was being issued on that disclosure, then the practitioner would need to consider whether the identified misstatements, if left uncorrected, are material individually or in the aggregate. But let's assume that the disclosure about work-related injuries is part of a broader disclosure about occupational health and safety, and the practitioner is providing a separate conclusion on whether the occupational health and safety information is prepared in all material respects in accordance with the framework or the applicable criteria. So in that case, the practitioner would determine whether misstatements related to the broader topic of occupational health and safety, including any misstatements identified on work-related injuries, are material either individually or in the aggregate, and therefore might affect the assurance conclusion. And then, also, if the practitioner is providing a single assurance conclusion on the entirety of the sustainability information that includes multiple topics and aspects of topics, so not only occupational health and safety, but maybe emissions, labor practices, biodiversity, then the practitioner would need to evaluate all uncorrected misstatements in determining whether the sustainability information is materially misstated. Clearly, not an easy task, and one that can involve considerable professional judgment depending on the circumstances. But as I noted, the exposure draft does include helpful guidance for that evaluation when dealing with both quantitative and qualitative information for different sustainability matters. So let's turn now to other information, and we'll talk a little bit about what it is, what the practitioner's responsibilities are, and consideration of misstatements in that other information. Now, the concept of other information is particularly important in sustainability assurance engagements. There's a link here to relevant ethical requirements, and the practitioner avoiding being knowingly associated with information that the practitioner believes contains a materially false or misleading statement, or omits or obscures information if that would be misleading. So what is other information? It's the definition is information included in a document or documents containing the sustainability information subject to the assurance engagement and the assurance report thereon. As Jamie noted earlier, it's the other stuff that's not subject to assurance by and large. So the sustainability information also may be presented together with the entity's audited financial statements, for example, as part of the annual report or some other reporting mechanism. And in those circumstances, the audited financial statements are considered other information for purposes of ED 5000. Now, the responsibilities for the practitioner are to read and consider the other information, but only that information that's available at the date of the assurance report. The IAASB didn't consider it appropriate to require the practitioner to obtain and consider other information that would be available after the date of the assurance report, such as required by ISSA 720 for listed entities today in an audit of financial statements, as that was just believed to be unreasonably onerous. One final point here is that if the other information is materially inconsistent with the sustainability information subject to assurance or the practitioner's knowledge obtained in the engagement, it may indicate that there's a material misstatement of either the sustainability information or the other information. Now, with respect to misstatements of other information, a misstatement exists when the other information is either incorrectly stated or otherwise misleading, such as if it omits or obscures information. And if the practitioner concludes that a material misstatement exists in the other information, then the practitioner would ask management to fix it. And if it isn't corrected after discussion with management and those charged with governance, then the standard includes requirements for appropriate actions. Now let's move to the next slide and talk a bit about communication with those charged with governance first. The proposed standard includes a high-level requirement for communication with management, those charged with governance, and others. The exposure draft requires the practitioner determine whether any significant matters have come to the attention to their attention that need to be communicated with those parties, and that's explained further in the application material, and there's some examples provided, such as those included on the slide here on the left. The IAASB also considered whether ED 5000 should address communications with those charged with governance in greater detail. However, this high-level requirement is consistent with ISA 3000, and given the evolving nature of sustainability reporting and the different topics and aspects of topics, the IAASB concluded that this principle-based requirement is appropriate, but is interested in stakeholder views in this area, including whether further detail is needed and the types of matters that might be communicated. So finally, on the reporting side, the reporting requirements in ED 5000 are based on those in ISA 3000 and 3410, and also draw on the EER guidance. However, in thinking about the format and required elements of the assurance report, the IAASB also considered feedback from the post-implementation review of the auditor reporting standards. And that feedback indicated demand from stakeholders to consider changes to assurance reports to align with the auditor's report for an audit of financial statements. The thought was that this would provide consistency across assurance and auditors' reports, particularly for the same reporting entity. And that was important for comparability and to provide a global baseline. So the IAASB has incorporated a few elements of the auditor's report into the reporting for sustainability assurance, such as the ordering of the report elements with the opinion or conclusion first, followed by the basis for that conclusion or opinion. An explicit statement about independence and other ethical responsibilities, including the name of the engagement leader for listed entities, and then a separate other information section. The approach to modifications to the assurance conclusion, an emphasis of matter and other matter paragraphs also was aligned with the auditing standards, ISSA 705 and 706 respectively. A final point on reporting was that members of our two IAASB reference groups also noted that there's a heightened need for communication by the practitioner in the report to meet the information needs of intended users, certainly in an environment that's evolving and maturing. So this reinforces the need to allow for the option of long-form reporting, and the exposure draft certainly acknowledges and provides for that option. One final point on key audit matters, and that's something that the IAASB discussed, pros and cons of including a communication of some kind of a key audit matter equivalent. But on balance, the board decided that it wasn't appropriate to require that communication in an overarching standard like 5,000, and instead we'll consider addressing that in a future a suite of ISAs. But there is a question about that in the exposure draft for those that would like to comment on that. So Josephine, I will stop there and turn it back to you.
Thanks, Dan. That's great. And of course, really appreciate that summary of some very, very important and exciting themes. A couple of things I just wanted to highlight for our participants is to re-emphasize your point that in respect of material misstatements, as Dan says, the IAASB have recognized that this is complex. And we have included quite a bit of application material and exposure draft to really help practitioners through this process. But feedback, to Dan's point exactly on whether we've got the balance right here, is really helpful. Often we hear two sides. We hear one group of participants and stakeholders saying there's just too much application material, but then the others that we need more. So, you know, we really, really want to hear from you. Do we have that right? And or alternatively, to our point earlier, Dan, you know, maybe it doesn't have to be in the standard itself, does it? It could be in non-authoritative guidance as well. I also wanted to reiterate the point that you've made that we were in a really fortunate position in terms of actually developing that reporting section, because we had that feedback from the post-implementation review that the assurance standards really need to step up in terms of the content and the layout of the reports. So that really actually, it was there and it was live evidence for us to actually use in pulling that together, which was super helpful. On reports though, we've had some questions on illustrations, and it'd be quite useful if you could explain to participants where we are with illustrative reports.
Yeah, certainly. The exposure draft does include 4 example illustrative reports of common scenarios, both with respect to reasonable assurance and limited assurance, including an example of a modified conclusion for a limited assurance engagement, and a more complex scenario of I'll call it a combined a combined report with different aspects of assurance. As always, we will expect that there will be calls for additional illustrations and additional guidance on reporting. Clearly, the reporting environment will continue to evolve and mature. There will be, different scenarios that will arise, different questions then that will arise. So the plan going forward is that the board and the staff will continue to monitor the reporting environment will look at requests for additional examples, and it's possible that additional illustrations could be provided down the road as a part either of some implementation materials, other forms of non-authoritative supporting guidance. And we also work, as always, closely with national standard setters around the globe to hear what they're hearing at a jurisdictional level and what might be provided there and how the IAASB might leverage that.
Yeah, no, very much so. On that point about combination of limited and reasonable assurance engagement, I had a question come through, which I'm going to pose to you, Dan, is whether the standard envisages the assurance report as separate only, or could it be combined with the audit report if done by the same practitioner?
Well, a good question, and I don't know that we have a good answer for it today. But I mean that is a reasonable question to be asked. Not unlike what could be done for in other scenarios. It has been done. So something to put on the to-do list, I guess, for the board in monitoring future developments. And again, seeing how practice evolves and how jurisdictions might either require or suggest reporting on these matters, and then follow that lead.
One that we shall continue to noodle on, our favorite term, Dan.
For sure.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for that. And I'm going to pop back to Michelle and ask us to move a couple of slides on now. Lovely. So that's right. So you already know, of course, that the standard was released for consultation at the beginning of August. And the closing date for responses to the ED is the 1st of December. So please do send in your feedback to the questions in the explanatory memorandum. There is actually a template too, which will hopefully make your life a little bit easier. You can just populate it rather than sometimes people have to write out all the questions again. So no need to do that anymore. We've also launched a stakeholder survey aimed at IAASB stakeholders who may not ordinarily respond to IAASB consultations. So that includes preparers of sustainability information, those with oversight responsibilities, investors, other users of sustainability information, and also, for example, the reporting standard setters as well. They may want to wish to respond to that survey option too. So those of you who are practitioners, please connect with your preparers, oversight, investors, etc., and encourage them to complete that survey. However, as you can see here, there's lots of other opportunities to learn more and, of course, participate in outreach. So including the webinar we had yesterday, which is on YouTube. Today's will be on YouTube. We also have comprehensive global outreach activity to come ahead. To come up with 4 global roundtables being held in Brussels, Kuala Lumpur, Sao Paulo, and New York, as well as 4 regional roundtable events in Australia, Japan, Africa, and Canada. We'll also be running these slides again on day 2 of an IFAC Sustainability Summit in the Asia Pacific region, which will be on the 28th of September. All of this is on our website, so you can get access to this information. A number of you asked at the beginning about having access or copies to the slides. In fact, as I say, they will be available on YouTube, so you can watch again and also share with your colleagues. So actually, all I have left now to do is to thank you again for participating and attending today, and also thank our wonderful panelists for providing all those insights and taking us through some of those deeper concepts within the standard. And I look forward to hearing and reading your comments at the beginning of December. So for now, that's